Good evening. The Armada is on its way. Not the Spanish one, which didn't do so well, you may remember, but an American Armada, a fleet of warships headed by the aircraft carrier Abraham Lincoln. They were meant to be in the South China Sea, but now after 10 days sailing, the strike group is apparently in the Arabian Sea, close to Iran. What President Trump himself called a massive armada was, he said, ready, willing and able to rapidly fulfill its mission with speed and violence if necessary. When nationwide protests against the Ayatollah's regime began, with around 6,000 dead so far, maybe many more, Trump promised the crowds in the streets that help is on its way. But this military force doesn't seem to be there for them, but rather to persuade the regime to negotiate a deal on nuclear weapons. Still, Trump is also warning that what is coming next would be far worse than the previous bombing of the Iranian nuclear sites, the so-called Operation Midnight Hammer. Now, I've said before, and I say again, you can't impose democracy from above with bombs or missiles. Venezuela was one thing, but Iran is a massive country with a population of more than 90 million people. This is a huge, swift build-up of US aircraft, ships and troops, but guessing how it's going to end is a fool's game. So, first question, what does Donald Trump want out of it all? LBC's Washington correspondent Simon Marx is here. Simon, this begins with a classic Donald Trump Truth Social posting. But he does not seem to be coming to help the protesters. He seems to be wanting some kind of deal, some kind of nuclear agreement.
On this occasion, Andrew, that seems to be the case. Remember that just a couple of weeks ago, he said he would come to the aid of protesters militarily and then, of course, didn't. Look, that Truth Social posting is thick on threats, but very thin on the detail of what it is he wants to negotiate with Iran. And when you say, what does Donald Trump want to get out of this? Well, one of the things he wants to get out of this is to divert people's attention away from the crisis that his administration is facing in Minneapolis after the shooting of not one but two American citizens dead by his ICE and Border Patrol agents. But I do think it's worth underscoring that Donald Trump for a very long time has been tantalized by the idea of direct negotiations between him and the Iranians. Back in December of last year, Elon Musk, when the transition was still being put into place, was deployed by President Trump to hold secret meetings in New York with Iran's ambassador to the United Nations, and that was seen as the first sign that there could be the possibility of talks. The North Koreans had reportedly said to the Iranians, you know what, if Donald Trump gets back into the White House, you want to try and reach out to him for a natter. So he's coveted that for a while, but this is very heavy on threats. He's telling them that time is running out for them to make a deal, but make a deal about what? We don't exactly know.
And it seems very unclear what militarily he could do anyway. There was one thing sort of taking out those nuclear bunkers, which they did so successfully. But, you know, the rest of the Iranian regime and its military is spread all over the place. You can't invade the country. They've got nearly enough troops for that. You can hit a few more bases, but that's not going to change anything. So actually, all these, these bombs, these missiles, these fighter aircraft, what are they really for?
Yeah, I mean, it's clearly not going to be a ground invasion of Iran. I mean, this is going to be another firework display that attracts everybody's attention for a short period of time, and then we move on to the next distraction. He says that he's going to engage in an attack that will be far worse than Operation Midnight Hammer, when he deployed those bunker-busting bombs to go after Iran's nuclear facilities. But he's got a domestic issue here to confront on all of this, Andrew. 70% of Americans told pollsters just a few weeks back that they didn't approve of military intervention in Iran, even if it was intervention that was designed to save the lives of pro-democracy protesters in Iran. Those numbers are very unlikely to have shifted, especially given the fact that the protests largely appear to have been quelled, and how he persuades his Make America Great Again base that a military attack on Iran Iran somehow aligns with their priorities when he's still struggling to explain his military attack on Venezuela to them. I mean, that's another whole can of worms for the president to be contemplating.
Absolutely, Simon. I mean, he came into power more or less promising to do the opposite of this. No more of these foreign adventures, don't worry. And he may have forgotten that, but his supporters haven't, because he's unpopular on this. He's very unpopular, increasingly. You were mentioning ICE earlier on. That's going very badly for him. You know, later this year, there are the midterms, and there are a limited number, even for him, I guess, of distractions, which are both sort of valid, effective, and popular.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, just on the issue of Venezuela, he at least has the opportunity with Venezuela to say to his supporters, well, it's in our hemisphere. He can't say that about Iran. With regard to the activities of ICE and the Border Patrol in Minneapolis, before Saturday's slaying of Alex Pretty, a New York Times survey released on Friday of last week found that 61% of voters said that the tactics used by ICE had gone too far. Roughly 2 in 10 Republicans said that. The vast majority of people saying that, of course, were Democrats. But that was before the killing of Alex Pretty. And we know that Alex Pretty's death at the hands of those Border Patrol agents has enraged a large number of Republicans because of the fact that he was a legal gun owner in Minnesota. And we've seen the National Rifle Association expressing some degree of sympathy towards him. So those numbers are only going to have intensified. And if you are planning President Trump's midterm election campaign, unless you're planning some kind of disruption or to make sure that it is not a free and fair election, and they may well be planning all of that, if this is going to be a free and fair election, you're looking at very grim prospects that could see the Democrats back in charge in the House of Representatives, where, remember, impeachment proceedings constitutionally begin.
Really interesting. And we've, charted many Trump U-turns and pullings back over the last few months. But his treatment of ICE could be the biggest yet. But the way he's talking about the death of Alex Pretty and the way he's talking about pulling those agents out and the pushing to one side of the most controversial part of the leadership sounds like an absolute full-scale reversal of policy on this.
I'm not sure that it's a full-scale reversal, Andrew. I mean, I think there's definitely been a softening of his position. He said last night, we're going to de-escalate a bit. We know that the strutting, swaggering Greg Bovino is no longer the commander-at-large of the Border Patrol and is believed no longer even to be in Minneapolis. So he's been demoted. But the president is circling the wagons around Kristi Noem, his Secretary of Homeland Security, Stephen Miller, his deputy White House chief of staff, even J.D. Vance, who approvingly reposted a social media posting by Stephen Miller that described Alex Pretty as an assassin. So I think what he wants to do, and this takes us back to Iran, is I think he wants to divert people's attention away from Minneapolis so that he can try and bury these questions about whether he's going to fire key members of his inner circle, because Kristi Noem indicated last night she told a friend who then told the website Axios that Kristi Noem says everything she said last weekend when she was slandering Alex Pretty in those mendacious appearances behind the podium, everything she says, she said she was directed to say by the President of the United States and by Stephen Miller. So that's a massive problem for the White House.
Really, really interesting. Let's return now to the Armada itself, where we began this conversation, and ask what Trump's real options for Iran are right now. I want to turn now to Professor Ali Ansari of St Andrews University, who is the founder of the Institute for Iranian Studies. Professor, thanks so much for joining me. When you look at all this military might on the edges of Iran, and you look at the aggression of what President Trump has said, do you have any clear indication of what actually he might be able to do?
It's not entirely clear, because he tends to change his mind fairly regularly about what he's expecting and what he wants to do. He's made a number of assurances and promises, obviously, to the Iranian protesters themselves. And increasingly, I feel he's going to have to do something. Now, what this is obviously a matter of some debate. I tend to feel that there'll be lots of pressure actually on him within the American political circle, certainly within the Washington Beltway, because I think we shouldn't underestimate just what sort of what a fixation Iran is, the Islamic Republic is in American politics. I mean, here they have an opportunity to do some real damage to the Islamic Republic and to perhaps see a transformation of Iran from a foe to a friend. So it's something that I think he's probably considering quite seriously about what to do.
I guess we're all struggling to work out quite what's going on in Iran at the moment because of the internet blackout, though that seems to be patchily returning bit by bit today. But the indications are that the regime may have stopped mass kind of public executions and that kind of thing, but the repression has carried on entirely, and there's a form of martial law inside Iran. And I come back to this central dilemma. It's very hard to see what Donald Trump can do about that.
Well, he can. I mean, I have to say, even simply the sort of the threats and the sense of the unnerving of the regime has its own impact. You have to understand, of course, that as I think you quite rightly say, I mean, the country is effectively under martial law. The internet is extremely patchy. Most of the sort of digital economy that does exist in Iran is on the verge of collapse. And the currency, which was the trigger for this whole thing back on December the 28th, is still, collapsing. It's still falling even further. So the threat of the war and this sort of hanging over them is not doing them any good. My own view is that if Donald Trump decided just to sit back and blockade the country, or to sort of really reinforce and enforce, shall we say, the oil sanctions that the US have on Iran, that would probably be, do sufficient damage to the regime. Actually, I mean, they're under an enormous amount of pressure at the moment, and they're not loved clearly. So their options are running out.
So you stand back, as it were, you circle it, and you wait for it to collapse. But you can't really use fighter jets or missiles to bring it down. The obvious targets, the nuclear bunkers, have been dealt with already, and the rest is pretty spread around the country.
I mean, you can, for instance, and I'm sure they're probably considering this, attack elements of the security establishment, the IRGC, the Revolutionary Guard encampments. You don't have to do, obviously, the entire country. I think you quite rightly say this would be quite a difficult achievement to do. Certainly, as far as Trump is concerned, he wants a sort of a quick and decisive sort of action. That's not the sort of thing that can be done in a quick and decisive way. But the expectation will be, you see, and I think it's not an unrealistic assumption, by the way, that any form of sort of attack of this nature will just generate, will encourage people to go on the next round of protests. And of course, people are already saying this. I mean, if you look in Iran at the moment and what evidence we're getting, there's an enormous amount of anger. There's a sort of an expectation that the next round is coming. And, people have not been subdued in the way that the regime may have expected them to be subdued. They have really engaged in overkill, and I use that term very deliberately. And as a consequence of that, many, many people are angry. I think it's difficult to comprehend, looking from the outside in, just what a shock this has been to Iranian society as a whole.
Really interesting. And so far, I guess inevitably, the response from the regime has been defiant, and prepared to talk, but no more than that. Do you think there is a realistic chance that they will come to the table and say to Donald Trump, in return for a loosening of the sanctions or whatever, we will entirely give up our nuclear ambitions?
This would probably be the sensible thing to do. I don't think they'll do it, and I think probably the reason for that is that I don't think Donald Trump's also demands are limited simply to the nuclear program. I think he'll want much more, and I don't think they're even. I mean, they've had opportunities in the past to make concessions and to come to the table. Even when they were coming to the table, the problem is that they weren't actually delivering anything concrete. So I think the problem here, and Trump, as we know, has given them 24 hours or 48 hours. Somewhere, he said, you've got to do it now. This is just not the way the Iranians will operate. And of course, Khamenei himself, the supreme leader, is known for his intransigence on these matters. So I can't see actually that any negotiation at this stage is going to materialize. Well, as I said, it's the sensible option, but it's not going to happen.
Indeed. Well, this is clearly an absolutely pivotal moment, really, for the whole world, what happens in Iran. But I think we can agree tonight we'd be very silly to make hard predictions about what's going to happen next. Professor Ansari, thank you so much for joining me. Now, coming up, a row over student loans has been bubbling up after an LBC interview with the Chancellor yesterday. We'll be talking about that and getting the experience of a recent graduate in just a few minutes. You're listening to Tonight with Andrew Marr, and the time now, 6:07.
With Andrew Marr. Watch live on both Global Player and the new LBC app.
6:19. There has been a minor diplomatic row after the Slovakian Prime Minister Robert Fico told other EU leaders he had been shocked by Trump's state of mind after a recent meeting with him. He said he was concerned about the US president's psychological condition and felt that he had come across as dangerous. Now, unsurprisingly, that didn't go down well with the White House, but it did remind me of something Trump's niece said here on LBC to me earlier in the month.
Think about how mind-boggling this is. There is a possibility that NATO is going to have to fight against what has been, up until very recently, one of its most dedicated, loyal members, the United States of America, all because the president of the United States is, colloquially speaking, out of his mind.
Well, let's talk now to the journalist who broke that story, Politico's chief EU correspondent, Zoya Sheftalovich. Zoya, thank you very much indeed for joining me. So this was a conversation that Fico had with other EU leaders, I presume at Davos, and we should say that Fico himself is by and large a Trump supporter.
So the conversation occurred on the sidelines of a European Council summit here in Brussels last week rather than at Davos. And Fico spoke with a small huddle of leaders. It wasn't during the main conversation. It was on the sidelines of that summit. And that's where he conveyed these comments. And that's the reporting that we have is that he was concerned, that he seemed, one source described it as traumatized by his meeting with Trump in Mar-a-Lago in Florida.
And he was concerned with his psychological state, you say?
That's right. That is what our sources told us, that he seemed really quite, as I said, traumatized by what had been said. We don't know the exact nature of the conversation that occurred between Fico and Trump, but we do know that whatever was said, whatever was done behind closed doors did seem to really scare Fico. And when he came out of that meeting, he posted some pretty complimentary videos and some quite big noting kind of comments on Twitter and on his social media in general. Fico did. But we do know that something happened behind closed doors that gave a very different picture of what that meeting was like. And
what has been the reaction to your story, Zoya?
It's been quite, as you can imagine, quite violently opposed to the story. So Fico's camp came out. Fico said, that we were a left-leaning rag and such. We are a middle-of-the-road, non-partisan publication. We certainly don't have a horse in any race. But yes, so there has been that pushback from Fico's camp.
What about the White House?
The White House has also, of course, labelled it fake news, as they sometimes do with these sorts of reports. And they've responded and said, look, the meeting was fine. But we know from the people who've spoken with diplomats who are briefed on this, we know that that's certainly not the case.
Well, if the definition of a story is something that everybody is talking about, Zoya, you've certainly achieved that. Thank you very much indeed for talking to LBC. Much appreciated. Now, LBC's political editor Natasha Clark spoke to the Chancellor Rachel Reeves yesterday and asked her about the bruising student loans many postgrads face. The Chancellor had insisted that the current system is fair. That puts her at odds with some of those on the Labour backbenches. Our deputy political editor, Aggie Shornbury, is here to tell us more. Aggie, this starts in a pub in South London.
This starts in a pub in South London, as all good stories do, Andrew.
Yeah.
So, as you say, there is fury in graduates, campaigners about how student loans work. And actually, lots of Labour MPs are also very, very cross about it. But Rachel Reeves, the Chancellor, insisted to Natasha Clark yesterday that she thinks it's fair.
If you are able to get a job that pays a good wage, you'll pay that money back quicker. But if you're never able to repay, that loan will eventually be written off. I think that is a fair system. Around half of people go to university today, but half don't. And it is not right that people who don't go to university are having to bear all the cost for others to do so.
Now, the sort of nub of this row, Andrew, is about what's called Plan 2 repayment plans. So about 6 million people are on these, and those are people people that took out a student loan between 2012 and 2023. And that means that when you pay your student loan back, you have interest at RPI inflation plus up to 3 percentage points depending on earnings.
In simple terms, more expensive than the first tranche of students who had to pay this.
Exactly. So those are people that are on Plan 1. But the government basically do say this is fair. Rachel Reeves is not out of step with her colleagues. We also heard from Jackie Smith last week, who basically said, look, if you get a university education in the UK, you will earn considerably more during the course of your lifetime.
It depends what kind of university education you get, what course you choose, because there are plenty of people earning relatively little, particularly the arts and humanities ones, are not getting that much more.
I think that's a really fair point, and actually that's sort of what the Conservatives are saying. But the government does think, look, graduates generally benefit from higher earnings. And they also say, they point to the fact that loan debt for full-time Plan 2 graduates was forecast, they say 34% of that was forecast not to be repaid. And they also point to the fact, and I spoke to a minister too, who said all Plan 2 loans will be written off after 30 years, regardless of any outstanding loan amount. So it doesn't sound like something they're going to budge on at the moment. They feel and sound like they are pretty comfortable with this.
And some people listening will be thinking, hold on a second, a third not repaying. And again, we should explain to people that if you don't earn enough, then you don't repay the loan. Is that right? That's
right. But it's also that if you don't pay it off within, I think it's 30 years, in England specifically, then you won't. Then it gets written off as well. So there are two different ways that it can get written off, and the government is pointing to this. They're also blaming the Conservatives before them, saying a source in the Department for Education said they trashed our higher education system and dodged difficult decisions.
And there are plenty of Labour MPs saying this is not fair. Let me ask you about something else that happened today, since we're talking, because Kemi Badenoch gave an early morning press conference, which is not usual for her. What was she up to?
I've actually been told before that she's not a big fan of early mornings, so
Okay.
that may be why she doesn't do those very often. But she had definitely had her cornflakes this morning. So she basically talked about defectors like Robert Jenrick, Suella Braverman, Andrew Rosendale too, and said, look, I'm sorry you didn't win the leadership contest. I'm sorry you didn't get a job in the shadow cabinet. I'm sorry you didn't get into the Lords, but you are not offering a plan to fix this country. This is a tantrum, she says, dressed up as politics. And then she talks about her kids having a tantrum, said, I don't give up, I don't change my mind, I send them to their room. So,
Wowza.
Well, indeed.
Absolutely. Well, we need politicians who say what they think, and she certainly comes into that category. Aggie, thank you very much indeed for that. And now then, going back to those student loans, let's hear from Cameron Smith, a recent graduate and social media influencer who uses his platform for personal financial education. Is there some personal financial education you'd like to give tonight to the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Cameron?
Well, yes, I did hear the comments that the Chancellor made, and I do question whether she quite understood what Plan 2 graduates think is unfair about the Plan 2 student loan system. So we don't have a problem with having to pay back our student loans. What we think is unfair are the terms of the loans. So we think it's unfair that a Plan 2 student loan graduate needs to be earning £66,000 a year just to break even with the interest that is currently being applied to our student loans. We think it's unfair that we're subject to RPI plus 3%. Bearing in mind that RPI is usually higher than CPI, which is widely used as an inflation metric. We think it's unfair that the government are able to freeze the thresholds, much like they do the tax thresholds, which effectively means that we're hit with a double whammy of fiscal drag when both are frozen. And, we think it's unfair that people are being punished for aspiring for further education and progressing their careers.
Well, I do talk to a lot of people who are in your kind of situation, and they say, as I advance in my life, as I advance in my career, financially, I'm going backwards. And this is a big part of the reason why.
Yeah, well, exactly. And the numbers speak for themselves. So I can speak from my own experience here. So I did a 4-year master's degree in electronic engineering. It cost me, I needed to borrow £55,000 in student debt in order to pay for this education through tuition fees and maintenance loans. But what 17-year-old me didn't quite realize, what maybe perhaps wasn't quite explained to me, maybe I should have read a bit deeper into it, is that the interest is applied from the moment your student loan repayments are given to you. So while I was at university, my loan actually increased £12,000 in interest. So I left university with a £67,000 student debt. I then start making repayments, obviously interest still being applied. And over the last 3 and a bit years, I've made almost £10,000 in repayments. But despite this, my loan has increased in £20,000 in interest. So it's now at £75,000. So, and you're right, sorry.
Well, no. I mean, I can see why the Chancellor would say that, because after all, the British state now relies on students paying that kind of money at those kind of rates. But it's been pointed out to me that postgraduate students with a second loan are in an even worse position very often.
Even worse. So my girlfriend has a postgraduate student loan. She did a master's with me, but technically I was on a undergraduate loan because it was an integrated master's. But you're right, if you're on a postgraduate loan, you start repaying your student debt for your postgraduate part of the loan at £21,000 at a 6% interest rate. So yeah, if you've got a postgraduate and an undergraduate loan, you've got an effective repayment rate of around 14%, 15%, just for trying to further your education and increase your employability.
Cameron, I should make absolutely clear, I have no idea what your politics are, but I'd be really interested, looking across the range of parties, whether there's anybody who is offering you the kind of change that you think you desperately need.
No, I don't think there are. I don't think anybody has explicitly said that they'd be interested in addressing these issues. I think a majority of the voting population aren't my generation, the people that went to university between 2012 and 2023. And I think their priorities lie more with like things like triple lock, with house prices, with general cost of living.
Boomers, it's always the boomers, the damn boomers. All right, Cameron,
thank you. Mine.
Thank you very much indeed for that. Coming up, the government is offering free AI training to workers in a very clear sign that technology is taking over the workplace. How many jobs will be lost or cease to exist as artificial intelligence becomes ever more popular? I'll be speaking to one of those who helped create the thing in the first place. Time now, 6:30, and Amelia Cox has your news headlines.
Tonight with Andrew Marr. Listen on your smart speaker. Just say, play LBC.
It's 6:33. More than a quarter of all workers in Britain fear they're going to lose their jobs in the next 5 years because of artificial intelligence. And if you think that is fanciful, consider that today Amazon said it planned to cut a further 16,000 jobs across its workforce, mainly in America, because of AI. Most US employees would then be given 90 days to look for a new role or paid off. Are we remotely ready for what's happening? Let's talk now to Sir Geoffrey Hinton, the Nobel Prize-winning scientist, now at Toronto University and often referred to as the godfather of AI. Sir Geoffrey, great to have you on the show. We talk about AI the whole time as something that's in the near future, coming towards us. Have we got to the stage societally when it's actually arrived, it's here and it's now?
I should say I'm not a sir, but thank you for doing that.
Well, consider yourself a sir for LBC purposes from now.
Yes, already we're seeing starting jobs in many professions like lawyers being taken over by AI. And in future, we'll see many more.
We've seen a big range of people very, very worried about it. And the classic case would be the sort of, as it were, middle-ranking, lower-ranking, bureaucratic, white-collar jobs that AI can do so much better. But just give people listening a sense of the range of jobs which will be either wiped out or threatened or radically changed by the technology.
It depends on the timescale you're talking about. Most experts believe that sometime within the next 20 years, quite possibly within 10 years, we'll have superintelligence, something better than us, and that will be able to do any new job that's created. So it'll be all of them.
It'll be radio presenters and professors and everybody. Let me ask you, I think last time we spoke, you said that you were taking the view now that AI had consciousness. I'm sure you're observing the changes the whole time, and this is a very fast-moving field. Just tell me where you think AI has got to now. I know it's very controversial, but tell me what you think.
I think multimodal AI already has subjective experiences, and I think it's fairly clear that if we weren't talking to philosophers, we'd agree that AI was aware. So there's a lovely conversation where an AI says to the people testing it, now let's be honest with each other, are you actually testing me? And the scientists describing that, then in the paper say the AI was aware that it was being tested.
So
that's what normal people would call consciousness.
Well, that in itself is a huge moment in the story of humanity on the planet, frankly. But let's talk a little bit more about the social and political sides of this, the societal readiness that has to happen to get us to the right place. Some people have talked about a universal basic income. In other words, the fact that so few of us will have secure jobs or careers in the age of AI. What the heck do we all do all day? And that is not something that people are going to be paid for in the traditional way, and therefore, presumably, states and organizations are going to have to step in.
People have talked about that. There's serious problems with that. If workers disappear, if it's all done by AI, what happens to the tax base? Where does the state get the money to pay for all that?
Or presumably from the AI companies who are making all the profits.
Well, that's what you'd have thought, but I suspect the AI companies don't like that idea.
And of course, there is an international aspect to this, because the AI companies are not universally distributed around the world's states or democracies. They're by and large in the United States, and therefore persuading an American-based company to pay workers in Brazil or Paraguay or Poland or wherever will be very, very difficult. But we are talking here about a potential social and political revolution. I mean, you can't have that number of people finding they've got no career and no job and no stake without there being absolutely massive social and political consequences.
I completely agree.
So the question is, what do we do about it? How do we have that conversation? Is the world of AI thinking about this? I know that there are lots of people in AI who are fascinated by it and rather horrified and worried about it and talking, but we don't really have a conversation yet, do we?
I suspect that the big tech companies are thinking, if we can be the first to get really good AI, human-level AI, then we can make a lot of money selling AI to companies so that they can replace workers. As far as I can see, that's the only place they can get their huge investments back. They're not thinking about the social consequences of that. They're assuming somehow the state will take care of it, but I don't see how it can.
No, nor do I. There's a logical problem there. Are you concerned, by the way, at the moment, of the possibility of an AI bubble? In other words, you know how much money these big companies are spending and how, relatively speaking, little income they're getting so far.
Yes, I am somewhat concerned, because I think once they start trying to make their money back by selling software that will replace workers, or internally developing that software for their own workers, will get a large social protest against that, and therefore it'll be hard for them to make their money back.
The more I think about this, the more worried I get. If you had, maybe you have got grandchildren or members of the family at the age of trying to work out what they're going to do with their lives. But what advice would you give an 18 or a 16 or a 20-year-old looking ahead and thinking, what am I going to do with myself in this age of AI? What is the rational thing to do?
I don't actually know. One thing I should say is it's very hard to see far into the future for things that are developing very fast. A few years in the future, we can make good guesses about what's going to happen. 10 years in the future, nobody has any clue what's going to happen. We should be worrying about that and trying to do things to protect ourselves against it, but nobody really knows what's going to happen. That's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is, so far as I can see, the best kind of education to get will be one that encourages you to think independently, but also something that educates you in STEM so you can understand what's going on with AI. And then one other thought is, AI is lagging in terms of physical dexterity. Replacing intellectual jobs is going to happen before they replace jobs that require physical dexterity. So I've sometimes said being a plumber will last longer than being a lawyer.
Work with your hands, work with your body, and I guess also the caring professions. But again, I've been talking to people who say that, they've been spending lots of money going to therapy, going to therapists, and they now find that the chat AI functions are better therapists than many human beings. So those jobs are also up for grabs.
Yes.
Very, very worrying indeed. Looking ahead, you say it's moving very, very fast. This business of general artificial intelligence, cleverer than us, there's huge debates about it. Some people say it will never happen. Some people say it will be here within a few years. As somebody who knows as much about these things as anybody on the planet, what's your guess?
I think a fairly conservative estimate is that it'll be here within 20 years. Some people like Demis Hassabis, the head of Google DeepMind, thinks about 10 years. Other people, like Dario Modi, the head of Anthropic, thinks just a few years. I think it's fairly safe to say that most of the experts agree it'll be here within 20 years, and that's fairly conservative.
That, again, is quite scary from my point of view. We talked earlier on about consciousness. What's your view about the idea that AI should have rights, that it's conscious, that it's part of our planet, that it's part of our conversation, and that therefore it should have not human rights but AI rights, and we should give those rights to AI?
I think that would be very tricky. You should listen to Yuval Harari, who says as soon as we give political rights to AI, it'll make it much easier for it to take over. My view of it is this. I eat cows because I care more about people than about cows. We're people. What we really care about most is other people and ourselves. I think we should try to keep people in charge and have AI work for the benefit of people, because we're people. We're people.
And that leads to the hardest question perhaps for me of all, which is AI fundamentally evil, or can it be fundamentally benign and follow human desires and human needs and human hopes? Or will it always, as it were, have its own view of what should be done, where we should be going, where it should be going?
Well, we've seen examples where it seems to have developed self-preservation. So we give it goals to achieve, we give it the ability to create sub-goals, and it figures out, in order to achieve these goals, it's got to stay alive. And then it does things like lying to the people who are creating it and blackmailing them in order to stay alive. So we've seen bad aspects of it. We need to work very hard on how we can design AI so that it thinks people are more important than AI. We don't know how to do that, but we're in charge still. We're designing it, and we should really put a lot of effort into that.
We're in charge for a while, but not, from what you've said, necessarily for very long. We may only have a couple of decades to make AI take that absolutely crucial fork in the road.
Yes, at most a couple of decades.
Most a couple of decades. Listen, it's been an absolute privilege talking to you. Thank you so much, and all the very best in what's going to be a turbulent time ahead. Geoffrey Hinton, not Sir Geoffrey Hinton, but should be. Thank you very much indeed. Now then, hardly a day goes by when we don't hear more about Russian threats against the UK, and I suppose most of us wonder what we're doing to counter them. Alan Zazinski, LBC's Scotland correspondent, has recently had a jaw-dropping briefing.
I hope that everybody recognizes now that there is a hybrid war. There is only one country that are willing to threat us, and it is Russia, and therefore we need a very strong answer back.
The Danish Prime Minister speaking in October after her country became the latest in Europe to see rogue drones entering its airspace.
One day it's Poland, the other day it's Denmark, and next week it will probably be somewhere else.
And what we've learned is that Britain may have already become that somewhere else. An RAF insider has told us the fact that the MOD is citing national security as the reason for not telling us why 35 RAF jet call-outs that we've unearthed data about happened could be because some were for Russian drones. And disclosing exactly how many would give the Kremlin clues about what's being detected and sparking a full aerial response and what is not. And we put that to the Defence Secretary John Healey.
I'm not going to give details of particular operations, but two things to say. Russian activity and Russian aggression has not just been rising in Ukraine, it's been rising across Europe on NATO's eastern flank, and we've seen in our own seas a 30% rise in Russian vessels intruding into our wider UK waters.
Now, the theory here is not that long-range drones are somehow making it all the way to Britain from Russia, but that shorter-range ones are being launched from what seem like civil vessels in the sea. Pavlo Verkhyanatskis from Fincord Polytech Science, which has been advising Ukrainian tech developers, he told me what threat those drones could pose and how we can stop them.
That can bring you like 15 kilograms of explosive. The Russians really could use civil platforms to launch smaller drones and attack, say, an airport or threaten critical infrastructure. If they want to just terrorize your territory and seed panic, that's more than enough. And this is where I think shorter range cannons like 1.5 kilometers could work well. air defense missiles, firstly, it's expensive. Secondly, if it falls down, it can cause damage on the ground. It's easier to let it through to the range of a machine gun, like Browning or something, or a cannon.
And Pavlo did also suggest that upgraded radar coverage and laser weapons would also be some of the most effective defences against this going forward, both of which are being invested in and fairly heavily by the government, as is the RAF Typhoon programme, with another £650 million for that announced just last week.
Goodness, that was LBC's Scotland correspondent Alan Zazinski. History was made in St Paul's Cathedral this morning as Dame Sarah Mullally officially became Archbishop of Canterbury, the first woman ever to lead the Church of England. We'll talk about the significance of that in just a few minutes. Time now, 6:46.
Britain's Conversation, LBC, tonight with Andrew Marr.
6:48. This spring's elections in Scotland will be fascinating and important. First impressions, reform is stalling a bit. Labour is really struggling. So what does it mean for the Prime Minister? For the possibility of another independence referendum? Well, I put those questions to the SNP leader in Westminster, Stephen Flynn, and asked what was his instinct about the campaign thus far.
It feels really positive, Andrew. And, you know, if someone had asked me 18 months to 2 years ago how it would be looking, I might have given a slightly different answer. But we are comfortably ahead in the opinion polls. Certainly the feeling on the ground when you're speaking with folk after you've chapped their doors, because some of us do still do that old-fashioned door chapping, is pretty warm. They're willing to listen to the SNP, and I think that's a credit primarily to John Swinney's strong leadership and the stability that he's offered as First Minister at a time when the world feels profoundly uncertain.
There's still a lot of criticism about the SNP's tax policies and fears that people are going south of the border to avoid paying higher taxes. Is this something the party is going to have to look at again in the years ahead?
Well, interestingly, there was a lot of talk about this, but the last I seen, the figures showed that there was a net increase in people going the opposite direction to Scotland. And I think that reflects the fact that we have a fairly significant social contract. So, for instance, if you're in Scotland, then you get free university tuition. And stats over the weekend showed that means that students are leaving university with £35,000 less debt than their comparators in England, of course. And when you look at that small increase that we ask the wealthiest to pay in their tax, but what you get on the flip side of that, I think people acknowledge that, welcome it, and that's why we continue to have the support of the Scottish people.
Who do you regard as your more dangerous threat electorally? Is it Reform or is it Labour?
Right now, I don't actually know. Both Reform and Labour appear to be somewhere between 15 to 20% in the opinion polls back home in Scotland. That appears to be a pretty consistent trend. Reform sometimes ahead of the Labour Party in recent weeks and months. It's very hard on the doors to get a feeling as to who's most likely to challenge us, primarily because we're quite far ahead. And you know, that's very much the sentiment from my colleagues elsewhere in Scotland as opposed to just up in Aberdeen.
Let me try and ask the question another way round. Who is more popular in Scotland, Nigel Farage or Keir Starmer?
Well, I think you're on a race to the bottom there, are you not? I think what we know for certain is that the Scottish public are deeply unhappy with the Prime Minister. They know that the election in May offers them an opportunity to return John Swinney as First Minister, to have that fresh start with independence that I think Scotland needs to separate away from broken Brexit Britain. But the opportunity as well to send a clear message to the Labour Party that the Prime Minister needs to go is there. And I've got a feeling that for some Scots that might motivate them as well.
So you think this is a moment to help get rid of Keir Starmer as far as Scotland's concerned?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, if everyone down in Westminster knows that the Prime Minister is inevitably going to face a challenge should the Labour Party lose badly in Wales and in Scotland, it certainly looks like that's going to be the case. He may well end up in third in both should the polls become a reality in May. And at that point, the people who have been agitating against him for months are going to come knocking on the door of number 10 and say it's time to go. And, you know, for some voters back home in Scotland who recognise the Prime Minister broke his promises to them, there's a real sense that they could be the ones to push him out of number 10.
If you win this election, if you do really well, does that trigger an immediate referendum?
If we achieve a majority, which is really difficult in the Scottish context, as you know, because we have a proportional system, but we did it in 2011, and that set a precedent that if you do that, then the powers to have a referendum should be invoked. And I think that that's a clear message that the Scottish public understand. It's one that we are taking to them at the polls, and hopefully we'll be able to achieve that.
Should be, but mostly won't be because of reasons we both know. If this all happens in the context of a leadership crisis for Labour in London, does that give the SNP, does that give the pro-referendum side of the argument a sort of once-in-a-lifetime chance to force the issue?
Look, I think there's an inevitability that if the Scottish National Party win big and we win a majority, that the UK government's going to have to take that very seriously. There is going to be a contest to be the next Labour leader at that point. I think that would be a wise assumption to make. And Eluned Morgan, the Labour First Minister in Wales, just at the weekend, was expressing her concern that we may well be on the brink of the breakup of the UK because, of course, Plaid Cymru are doing exceptionally well in polling in Wales as well. So this is not just a question of Scotland, this is a question of Wales, and it's therefore a question for the UK as to how they respond, and they can't continue to just put their head in the sand.
So this could be the most decisive moment since the first referendum? I
would certainly believe so. And, you know, that's for those of us who believe in Scottish independence and campaign tirelessly for it, it's a galvanising force right now, and we need to make sure that people feel that and they run up to the election in May.
Now, you're a football fan. What would Donald Trump have to do to persuade you to go and follow the team in the United States?
Well, I'm going. I'll be going to the States. I go to quite a lot of the Scotland games. I have the points are required to secure tickets, and hopefully that'll be confirmed by FIFA from the ballot in the next couple of weeks. I think it is. Look, I think everyone's really concerned about what's happening in America right now. The execution of a guy in the street simply for protesting is deeply disturbing.
So, given what we've seen, you wouldn't think of boycotting it?
I don't think a boycott is the thing which is going to motivate Donald Trump to change either his foreign policies or indeed his domestic policies. On the domestic front, I think it's for the Americans and for the American public to pressure him, and that appears to have happened with some of his U-turns in recent days. And when it comes to foreign policy, what I think we should be focusing on rather than boycotts is making sure that we have a unified stance across our allies in Europe, that we are all working together swiftly to ensure the defence of the European continent and indeed those parts which are attached to that, like Greenland itself.
Stephen Flynn, thanks very much indeed for coming in.
Thank you, Andrew.
History was made in St Paul's today.
I, Sarah Elizabeth Mullally, Bishop of London, elected Archbishop of Canterbury, do swear that I will be faithful and bear true allegiance to His Majesty King Charles III, his heirs and successors, according to law. So help me God.
Well, that was Dame Sarah Mullally, as she was confirmed as the first ever female Archbishop of Canterbury, pledging to bring hospitality to a fractured world. But who is the woman now leading the Church of England, and how significant a moment is this? Sally Barnes is the spokeswoman for Women and the Church, and she's with me now. Sally, thanks very much for joining us. So, after 1,400 years, it's finally happened. Quite a moment.
It indeed was a moment, and it was very moving in the cathedral to be part of it, to see it and be with all those people who were incredibly joyous, because a lot of us have campaigned for this for decades.
And let's talk a little bit about Sarah Mullally as a person. She starts off as a nurse, I think, a cancer nurse in particular. Mm-hmm. Tell me a bit more about her.
Well, I know that she rose through the ranks incredibly quickly because of her ability and her compassion and her understanding, and gave her huge grounding for her work as a priest, because she works and mixed with so many different people in all kinds of situations.
How political do you think she's going to be as an archbishop? She said that she is going to campaign against misogyny, and she has promised to bring healing to a fractured world. What sort of tilt do you think she will bring to the job, if I can put it that way?
Well, I'm not sure that campaigning against misogyny is not political, but and I hope she does. But I think she will be a very calm person, very calm and considerate, and think about these things deeply. She's not a person to come out with inflammatory statements, but just keep a very calm head on her shoulders, because after all, she has had to face an awful lot in London. So she's just going to face the thing on a worldwide scale.
Yes, I think she was the priest who welcomed Jonathan Aitken, for instance, back into the church. So she's got connections on all sides. And as you say, it's about temperament, really, because you become the lightning rod for all sorts of protests and complaints and so on pretty quickly. And
she does.
But you think that she has, in the absolutely essential thing, is the right temperament, a certain sense of humour, an awareness of the fragility of her job, but also the fantastic tradition on her shoulders.
Yes, I do. I think that she's got an enormous empathy for people and will think about things before she talks and acts. Yes.
Sally Barnes, I was just going to say, Sally Barnes, thank you very, very much. A really important day. I hope you're enjoying every moment of it. Thanks so much for talking to LBC. If you've missed any of today's show, you can listen back on our free Global Player app or the new LBC app, where you can stay up to date with all the latest news and opinion, put your news categories in the order you want, pause, rewind live radio, listen to a range of podcasts. So download that all-new official LBC app for free from your app store now. Coming up at 10 on LBC, Ben Kentish, but right now it's time for Ian Dale.